February 6, 1972. Pomona drag strip, California. Bill "Grumpy" Jenkins rolled to the starting line in an untested Chevrolet Vega, a car nobody had ever seen before. He'd qualified dead last in the top half of the field, 17th out of 32. The Hemi teams were laughing in the pits. The tech inspectors were scratching their heads. And NHRA officials? They had no idea what was about to happen. Because what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Jenkins had just built the car that would break pro stock forever. 9.63 seconds later, everything changed. And NHRA would spend the next 2 years scrambling to write rules that would make sure it never happened again. Welcome back to Regal Rides. I'm a host name, and today we're diving deep into one of the most controversial cars in NHRA history. Bill "Grumpy" Jenkins' 1972 Chevrolet Vega. This is the car that broke the pro stock mold, forced permanent rule changes, and set a speed record that stood as a benchmark for years. But here's what most people don't know. The car was acid-dipped, built on a secret tube chassis, and ran weight breaks that had Chrysler teams crying foul. By the time NHRA figured out what Jenkins had done, it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. In this video, we'll cover how Jenkins built this revolutionary machine, why it dominated so completely, the controversy that erupted in tech inspection, and the lasting rule changes that reshaped pro stock forever. And if you're a fan of drag racing history like this, make sure you're subscribed to Regal Rides and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our next deep dive. To understand why the 1972 Vega was so revolutionary, you have to understand what pro stock looked like before it arrived. NHRA introduced the pro stock class in 1970 as a factory hot rod category. Real production cars with minimal modifications. Jenkins actually won the very first pro stock national event at the 1970 Winter Nationals, driving a converted 1968 Camaro that ran 9.98. The first 9-second pass in pro stock history. But by the end of 1970, Chrysler had figured out the formula. The Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin Plymouth Barracudas and Dodge Challengers, powered by the legendary 426 Hemi, began dominating. And I mean dominating. Between 1970 and 1971, Chrysler teams won 12 of 15 NHRA national events. The Hemis had a massive cubic inch advantage. 426 inches versus the Chevy's 427 and 396 big blocks. Under NHRA's universal 7.0 pounds per cubic inch rule, all cars ran around 3,000 pounds. The Hemis made 600 plus horsepower and were leaving everyone else in the dust. Jenkins went winless in 1971. Not a single national event. For a guy who'd built his reputation as a giant killer, this was unacceptable. So how do you beat a 426 Hemi? Simple. You don't try to outpower it. You outthink it. And Bill Jenkins was about to prove that the lightest, smallest, most underestimated car on the planet could destroy them all. But first, he had to convince NHRA to change the rules. If you don't know Bill "Grumpy" Jenkins, you need to. Born December 22, 1930, in Pennsylvania, William Tyler Jenkins earned his engineering education at Cornell University. Though he never finished his degree. What he did finish was teaching himself how to build the most reliable, powerful small-block Chevrolet engines in drag racing. He got the nickname Grumpy not because he was mean, but because he had no time for idle chatter. When he was at the track, he was focused, calculating, always looking for the next advantage. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there to win. By 1972, Jenkins had already made history. In 1966, his 327 cubic inch Chevy Nova, running against 426 Hemi cars, made him a legend as the ultimate giant killer. He won the inaugural pro stock races at Pomona and Gainesville in 1970. But after going winless in 1971, Jenkins knew something had to change. And he had a plan. After the 1971 season, NHRA had a problem. Chrysler was dominating so thoroughly that fans were losing interest. Chevrolet and Ford drivers were staying home. The class was dying. NHRA competition director Steve Gibbs admitted it openly. At the end of 1971, there was no doubt that Chrysler had achieved total domination of pro stock, and the class was bound to suffer. Verify, exact quote from Steve Gibbs. So NHRA made a controversial decision. For 1972, they would split the weight breaks. Small block wedge engines could run at 6.75 pounds per cubic inch. Big blocks would run at 7.25 pounds per cubic inch. The idea was simple: lighter weight for smaller engines would level the playing field. But here's the thing. NHRA made this rule change thinking teams would build lighter versions of existing cars. Lighter Camaros. Lighter Challengers. What they didn't expect was Bill Jenkins. In November 1971, Jenkins sat down with NHRA manager Jack Hart and pitched a radical idea. What if I build a pro stock car around a Chevrolet Vega? The Vega was GM's new subcompact. A tiny, lightweight economy car with a 4-cylinder engine. It had never been sold with a V8. But Jenkins saw potential. A 331 cubic inch small block at 6.75 pounds per inch meant his car would weigh 2,234 pounds. Compare that to a 426 Hemi at 7.25 pounds. 3,088 pounds. Jenkins would have an 854-pound advantage. So NHRA gave him the green light. And for the next 2 months, Jenkins and his crew, Joe Trison, Dick Whitman, and Tom Kerr, went to work. 1,400 man-hours. Around the clock. What they built in that Malvern, Pennsylvania shop would shock the drag racing world. Here's how they did it. Jenkins started with a body-in-white Vega shell, meaning a bare body with no paint, no insulation, no undercoating, just raw steel. And then he went further. The entire body was acid-dipped. This was a process where the car's sheet metal was submerged in an acid bath to chemically remove material and reduce weight. It made the panels lighter, but also weaker, prone to stress cracks over time. One restoration decades later found 37 years of stress cracks from that original acid dipping. But the real secret was the chassis. While NHRA's rules technically still required production-based frames, Jenkins bent them as far as they'd go. He built what many consider Pro Stock's first tube chassis. A fully fabricated frame constructed by SRD race cars to his own specifications. Steel tubing replaced the factory frame rails. The firewall was fabricated. The floor was custom. This wasn't a modified Vega. It was a race car wearing a Vega body. For the engine, Jenkins started with his bread-and-butter combination. A small block Chevrolet 327 block, bored out to 331 cubic inches. The engine featured dual Holley 4-barrel carburetors, a custom camshaft, and ported cylinder heads. Jenkins claimed 580 to 585 horsepower at the flywheel. Conservative numbers for what this engine could really do. Remember, Jenkins was famous for sandbagging, never revealing his true power numbers. The transmission was a manual 4-speed. In an era before Lenco planetary gearboxes, Jenkins had to shift through the gears himself. And he was legendary at it. In 1972, he would record 250 consecutive passes without missing a single shift. Testing was done quietly. Jenkins didn't want anyone knowing what he had until race day. But the numbers were staggering. The Vega was running low, 9.6-second passes in testing. As fast as the quickest Hemis, but with instant throttle response and better launch characteristics. The light weight meant the car could leave the line harder. The short wheelbase meant it transferred weight to the rear tires instantly. Everything about the Vega was optimized for acceleration. There were other tricks too. Jenkins drilled holes in the Dana 60 rear-end webbing to save weight without compromising strength. He used lightweight components everywhere. Aluminum where he could get away with it. Magnesium wheels. Thin-gauge tubing. The car even had adjustable weight bars that Jenkins could add or remove depending on whether he was running a national event or match racing. For match races, he'd add 40 pounds to the rear bumper to make the car wheel stand. Because as Jenkins said, wheelies sell t-shirts. By January 1972, the car was ready. Jenkins loaded it onto the trailer and headed to Pomona for the NHRA Winter Nationals. Nobody knew what was coming. The NHRA Winter Nationals. Pomona, California. 32 of the fastest pro stock cars in the world. And then there was this weird little Vega that nobody had ever seen before. The Hemi teams were laughing. The tech inspectors were scratching their heads. And Bill Jenkins? He was about to make them all eat their words. Qualifying day did not go as planned. The Vega was untested on the actual track, and Jenkins was having suspension problems. The car wouldn't hook. It was skating. His best qualifying pass was a 9.90, painfully slow by pro stock standards. He qualified 17th out of 32. Meanwhile, Stu McDade in Billy Stepp's Dodge Challenger qualified number 1 with a 9.59. That meant Jenkins would have to race McDade, the fastest car in the field, in the very first round. It looked like the Vega experiment was over before it started. But that night, Jenkins and his crew made pivotal suspension changes. They adjusted the weight distribution, stiffened the rear springs, changed the launch RPM, When race day came, Jenkins was confident. Maybe too confident. First round, Bill Jenkins versus Stu McDade. The Dodge Challenger ran a 9.75. Respectable. Fast enough to beat most of the field. But the Vega? The Vega ran 9.63. And just like that, the number 1 qualifier was gone. Round 2, Jenkins defeated another Hemi. Round 3, another Hemi. Round 4, another Hemi. And in the final, Jenkins faced Don Grathair's Hemi-powered Dodge and beat him too. 5 Hemi cars. 5 wins. And the little Vega that qualified 17th? It had just won the biggest pro stock race of the year. After Pomona, the Vega was no longer a curiosity. It was a threat. Jenkins went to Gainesville for the Gator Nationals and won again. Then Columbus. Then Indy. By mid-season, Jenkins had won 6 of 8 NHRA national events. The car was running consistent 9.6s, sometimes dipping into the 9.5s. It was fast, reliable, and unstoppable. The other teams were furious. Chrysler teams especially. They'd invested millions in development, and now this little Chevy Econobox was beating them. Protests were filed. Competitors demanded NHRA tear down the engine. They wanted to know how much it really weighed. They claimed Jenkins was lying about the weight. Rumors spread that the Vega was running underweight, that the tube chassis was illegal, that the acid dipping gave an unfair advantage. NHRA's tech inspectors started pulling the car for inspection after every round. They weighed it, measured it, checked cubic inches. And every time, Jenkins was legal. Barely legal, but legal. Hot Rod magazine ran a feature in December 1972. The article noted that Jenkins had won 6 of the 8 events and was making a reported $250,000 that year, matching Wilt Chamberlain as the highest-paid professional athlete in America. Time magazine even profiled Jenkins, the first drag racer to get mainstream national coverage. 6 wins, 1 championship, $250,000. And NHRA had no choice. They had to do something. But here's the thing. Jenkins hadn't broken a single rule. He just bent them so far that NHRA couldn't keep up. What happened next would change pro stock forever. The controversy. The controversy wasn't a single moment. It was a slow-building realization across the 1972 season that NHRA had created a monster. Every time Jenkins won, the tech inspectors pulled the car. Every time they pulled it, they found it was legal. And every time it was legal, the Chrysler teams got angrier. The weight was the biggest sticking point. Jenkins' Vega was required to weigh 2,234 pounds minimum, 331 cubic inches times 6.75 pounds per cubic inch. Competitors swore it was lighter. They claimed Jenkins was hiding weight in places that couldn't be measured on the scales. They said the acid dipping had reduced the weight below legal limits. Some even claimed he was running lightweight fiberglass panels disguised as steel. NHRA weighed the car repeatedly. Post-race inspections. Mid-season spot checks. They measured cubic inches to verify the 331 displacement. They checked the chassis for illegal modifications. And every single time, the car was legal. But just barely. Jenkins was a master at hitting the minimum weight exactly. Not an ounce heavier than required. The tube chassis was another issue. NHRA's rules required production-based frames. But what did that mean? Jenkins' chassis used the Vega body mounting points, but everything underneath was custom tubing. Was that legal? NHRA hadn't specifically outlawed it, so technically yes. But it violated the spirit of the factory hot rod concept. This wasn't a modified production car. It was a purpose-built race car. NHRA never disqualified Jenkins. They couldn't. He hadn't broken any rules. But they knew they had a problem. The Vega's dominance was killing manufacturer diversity. Chrysler teams were threatening to boycott. Ford was bringing in Pintos to compete with the Vega. The entire class was shifting towards subcompact cars that had never been sold with V8 engines. This wasn't what pro stock was supposed to be. So NHRA did what they always do when one combination dominates. They changed the rules. For the 1973 season, NHRA made 2 major changes. First, they tightened the chassis rules. The new regulations specified exactly what constituted a production-based frame and limited the extent of modifications. Tube chassis weren't explicitly banned, but the rules made it harder to build one that passed inspection. Second, they adjusted the weight brakes again. The gap between small blocks and big blocks narrowed. The idea was to reduce the advantage that cars like Jenkins' Vega had over larger, heavier cars. But here's the kicker. They also introduced a rule change that would benefit Jenkins. Starting in 1973, pro stock records could be set at any national event, not just specific record runs. At the 1973 Winter Nationals, Jenkins drove his Vega to pro stock's first official speed record, 148.76 miles per hour. Dyno Don Nicholson set the ET record with a 9.33. So in a weird twist, NHRA's attempt to slow Jenkins down actually gave him a place in the record books forever. Jenkins never apologized. He never defended himself. His attitude was simple: I followed your rules. If you don't like the results, that's your problem, not mine. In interviews, Jenkins was matter-of-fact about the Vega. He told reporters, I was going to build the Vega whether NHRA went with a weight brake format or not. I could have used it for match races. In other words, he'd built the car to win. And if NHRA hadn't changed the rules, he'd have just run it in unsanctioned events where the paydays were even bigger. When competitors accused him of running underweight, Jenkins would point to the tech inspection sheets. Legal every single time. When they claimed the tube chassis was illegal, he'd cite the rulebook. Nowhere did it specifically prohibit what he'd done. Jenkins was an engineer. He understood rules as written, not as intended. And he had a point. NHRA had created the weight brake system to encourage diversity. Jenkins had simply maximized the advantage they'd handed him. He'd outsmarted them, not cheated them. Other drivers supported Jenkins. Bob Glidden, who would go on to dominate pro stock in the 1980s with his own small block Fords, later said Jenkins taught everyone in the class how to think like an engineer. Dyno Don Nicholson brought out Ford Pintos specifically to compete with the Vega. Ronnie Sox even praised Jenkins' innovation, even though Chrysler's Hemi program was the biggest loser from the rule changes. So Jenkins was vindicated. He'd won on the track and won in tech. But NHRA wasn't done. The rule changes they implemented because of the Vega didn't just affect Jenkins. They reshaped pro stock for the next 50 years. The 1973 rule changes were just the beginning. Over the next few years, NHRA systematically closed every loophole Jenkins had exploited. Tube chassis were redefined. Weight brakes were adjusted multiple times. By 1982, NHRA gave up on the pounds per cubic inch system entirely and moved to a flat 500 cubic inch, 2,350 pound formula that's still used today. But the biggest change? NHRA accepted that pro stock was never going back to true factory hot rods. Jenkins' Vega proved that the future of the class was purpose-built race cars. Within 2 years, everyone was running tube chassis cars with bodies that had never been sold with those engines. Ford Pintos, MC Gremlins, Plymouth Arrows, all following Jenkins' blueprint. Jenkins didn't slow down. In 1973, he continued running the Vega and won multiple national events. He set that 148.76 miles per hour speed record at Pomona. The car was still competitive, still fast, still legal under the new rules. But the competition was catching up. Bob Glidden debuted his Ford Pinto. Gap and Roush brought out their Cleveland-powered Pintos. Ronnie Sox stayed with Chrysler but switched to lighter Plymouth Dusters. Suddenly, the Vega wasn't alone anymore. The small block subcompact revolution Jenkins started was spreading. But Jenkins was already thinking ahead. In 1974, he built a new Vega. Grumpy's Toy 11. This one went even further. It was the first pro stock car with a full tube chassis that nobody could dispute. It featured McPherson's strut front suspension. Another first for drag racing. Dry sump oiling system. Another first. And it ran 8.74 at 154 miles per hour, breaking into the 8-second zone. That 1974 Vega won 13 national events and became the template for modern pro stock. Everything Jenkins pioneered, tube chassis, strut suspension, dry sump oiling, is still used in pro stock today. But the 1972 Vega? What happened to the car that started it all? The original tube chassis game changer? Well, that car has a story of its own. And it's still out there today. The 1972 Vega changed pro stock forever. Before Jenkins, pro stock was about modified production cars. Real Camaros, Challengers, and Cudas you could theoretically buy at a dealership. After Jenkins, pro stock became about engineering. It became about finding every advantage in the rulebook. It became about innovation over tradition. Today's pro stock cars are direct descendants of that 1972 Vega. They run full tube chassis. They use strut-style front suspensions. They maximize weight distribution with carefully placed ballast. They're built around the minimum weight formula, not around what the factory produced. And every single one of them owes a debt to Bill "Grumpy" Jenkins. The 1982 rule change to 500 cubic inches and 2,350 pounds? That exists because of the chaos the Vega created. NHRA realized they couldn't keep chasing loopholes, so they created a simple, flat formula that's still used today. The modern Pro Stock class, with its planetary transmissions, carbon fiber bodies, and 700-plus horsepower engines? That's all Jenkins' legacy. He proved that Pro Stock wasn't about stock cars. It was about pushing the limits of what stock could mean. Once Jenkins proved the formula worked, everyone copied it. Bob Glidden became the most successful Pro Stock driver of all time by following Jenkins' blueprint. Glidden ran small-block Fords in Pintos, Fairmonts, and eventually Thunderbirds. He won 10 NHRA Pro Stock championships using the lightweight, small-block formula Jenkins pioneered. Lee Shepard won 3 championships in the 1980s with a Chevrolet Camaro that used Jenkins' tube chassis design. Warren Johnson, another legend, built his career on small-block Chevys and Pontiacs using Jenkins' engineering principles. Even Chrysler eventually gave up on the Hemi. By the late 1970s, Plymouth was running small-block wedge engines in Aero compacts. Basically their version of the Vega. The Hemi era was over and Jenkins had killed it. The irony? By 1985, Pro Stock had become so expensive and so specialized that most teams couldn't compete unless they bought engines from Bill Jenkins. His shop in Malvern, Pennsylvania, became the place to get horsepower. Competitors who'd once protested his Vega were now writing him checks for $50,000 engines. Bill "Grumpy" Jenkins passed away on March 29, 2012, at the age of 81, from heart failure in Powley, Pennsylvania. He was inducted into the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in 2008 and ranked number 8 on NHRA's top 50 drivers of all time. His engines won 8 NHRA championships, even after he stopped driving. As for the original 1972 Vega, Grumpy's Toy X, it survived. Jenkins sold it in 1974 after building his new Vega. It changed hands several times, running in supergas and bracket racing through the 1990s. In 2010, drag racing collector Mark Pappas tracked the car down. With Jenkins' help, Pappas spent 3 years restoring it to original 1972 specifications. Jenkins himself authenticated the car in 2011, just a year before he died. He supplied original parts from his shop. Ignition components, brakes, even engine parts he'd saved for 40 years. The restoration had to repair 37 years of stress cracks from the original acid dipping. In 2013, the restored Grumpy's Toy X made its public debut at PRI. A living piece of drag racing history. As for the 1974 Vega, Grumpy's Toy 11, that car sold at auction in 2007 for $577,500, making it the most expensive Vega ever sold. So was Bill Jenkins an innovator or a rule-bender? A genius or a guy who exploited loopholes? That debate still rages today. But one thing nobody can deny, he changed drag racing forever. And that 1972 Vega? It's the car that broke the mold and rewrote the rulebook. So let's recap. Bill "Grumpy" Jenkins took advantage of a weight brake rule change, built a tube chassis Vega that weighed 854 pounds less than the competition, and won 6 of 8 NHRA national events in 1972. He set Pro Stock's first official speed record at 148.76 miles per hour. He made $250,000 in one season. And he forced NHRA to completely rewrite the rules. 3 key takeaways from this story. First, innovation wins. Jenkins didn't have the biggest engine or the most factory support. He had engineering knowledge and the guts to try something nobody else would. And that was enough to beat the mighty Hemi. Second, rules are only as strong as their wording. NHRA intended the weight brakes to help existing teams lighten their cars. Jenkins used them to build an entirely new kind of race car. That's not cheating. That's reading between the lines. Third, change is inevitable. NHRA tried to preserve the factory hot rod concept, but Jenkins proved it was obsolete. Pro Stock was always going to become a class of purpose-built race cars. The Vega just accelerated the timeline by a decade. Today, Pro Stock is one of NHRA's premier classes. The cars run 6.4-second ETs at over 210 miles per hour. They're technological marvels worth $500,000 each. And every single one of them exists because Bill Jenkins built a little Vega in 1972 and refused to play by anyone's expectations. So what do you think? Was Bill Jenkins an innovator who pushed the limits of Pro Stock? Or did he bend the rules so far that NHRA had to step in and stop him? Let me know in the comments below. I love hearing from you guys, and this one's definitely a topic where people disagree. If you enjoyed this deep dive into drag racing history, make sure you're subscribed to Regal Rides. We cover banned cars, controversial drivers, and the stories NHRA doesn't want you to know every single week. Hit that subscribe button and bell icon so you don't miss the next video. And if you learned something new today, or if this brought back memories of watching Grumpy race, give this video a thumbs up. It helps us reach more drag racing fans like you. Next time on Regal Rides, we're covering another car that dominated so hard NHRA had to change the rules. Don Garlett's rear-engine top fuel dragster. The innovation that saved his life and almost got him banned. You won't want to miss it. See you next time.